All right, so today we're diving deep into something, a topic that hits close to home for a lot of us, monogamy. We've
Yeah.
got a whole pile of sources here, personal stories, expert opinions, the works.
hmm
And one thing's for sure, there's no easy answer when it comes to, what makes a relationship work.
Right, right. It's really interesting because the idea of monogamy, well, it's not a simple on or off thing.
Yeah.
It's more of a spectrum,
Yeah.
with all sorts of
Yeah, for
variations.
sure.
And, that's what we're going to be digging into. We'll be looking at the history of monogamy, all the challenges it faces, and, well, all those other ways people are doing relationships these days. The alternative models that are becoming more and more common.
Yeah, exactly. So have you ever, wondered if maybe the whole one person forever thing, well, maybe it's not the whole story.
hmm
Maybe there are other ways to have love and commitment.
Right.
And, well, that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking today.
To kick things off, maybe we should just address the big question, the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Is monogamy, is it even natural? I mean, if you look back in time across different cultures, you see so many ways that humans have done relationships.
It's true. And, yeah, the sources we have really point that out. One story that really stood out to me was about this couple. They decided to open up their marriage after, years of thinking they were happy being monogamous.
Oh, wow.
And it really makes you stop and think, right? Is it even realistic to expect one person to fulfill all our needs and desires? Forever?
Such a good question. And it really gets to the heart of, how much of what we think about relationships is shaped by culture, not just biology.
Right.
There's a researcher in the source material who, they point out that the way we do relationships, it's a mix of things, right?
Mhm.
Our biology, our psychology, and our social world, too.
Yeah.
We're not just robots running on instinct, right? We're influenced by everything around us.
That makes a lot of sense. But then, okay, how do you tell the difference between something like C&M, consensual non-monogamy, where it's all agreed on? Like, couples agree to have other relationships. How's that different from, cheating, which is usually a betrayal?
Well, the big difference is communication, and consent.
Yeah.
The source material, it really emphasizes this. C&M, it's all about being open and setting boundaries that everyone's okay with.
Uh-huh.
It's not about sneaking around or lying. It's about making decisions together, consciously.
Okay, so that sounds good in theory, but I got to say, reading some of these personal stories, things can get messy even when everyone's supposedly on the same page about, non-monogamy.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
There's this woman, Sophie.
Mm-hmm.
She was okay with her partner having, flings, but she drew the line at him dating any of her friends or students.
Right.
And guess what?
What?
He ended up falling for one of her students.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Ouch. That's rough.
it is.
That's a really painful example of how even when you think you're clear about things can go sideways. And I think it shows just how important it is to keep talking to each other, to be willing to change those boundaries as you go.
Yeah.
There's another story, too, in the source material. This guy, Dominic, he thought he was totally fine with his partner having casual encounters. But then his partner, they developed a deep connection with someone else.
And that was a problem.
Total blindside for him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it seems like no matter what the rules are, there's always the chance that someone will end up hurt, feeling betrayed. Is that just human nature?
Well, the source material gets into this idea of transgression, like this pull towards the forbidden. And it argues that, it's not just about breaking the rules. It's about, the thrill of pushing those boundaries, exploring the unknown.
Right.
And that desire, it can be there even in open relationships, adds another layer to the whole thing, navigating consent and desire and all that.
So is the appeal of non-monogamy, is it all about just wanting to break the rules and have more sex? Or is there something more to it?
That's a really common idea people have, but the reasons people explore non-monogamy, they're way more complicated than that. The source material introduces us to this woman, Iris, and she really wants that feeling of choosing to be with her partner every day, not just staying out of obligation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and then there's Barney, who is basically done trying to fit himself into that, the monogamous box.
Right.
He wants to be in relationships where it's all about honesty, radical honesty right from the start.
Okay, so it's not just physical.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's this real need for deeper connection. being true to yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about Diana. Her feminist values, they kind of clash with this idea of one person, owning her sexuality.
Right.
She believes in having meaningful connections with, multiple people. And her long-term partner, Ed, he's on the same page.
Their story's interesting, though, because even within their, non-monogamous agreement, they each have a different style.
Oh, how so?
Diana, she likes having a few steady partners, people who feel like family to her. But Ed, he's more open to meeting new people.
Oh, okay. So it just goes to show there really isn't one right way to do non-monogamy,
Right.
And that actually leads us to this idea of new monogamy, which the source material describes as, a more flexible, more inclusive way of understanding what it means to be committed.
Okay.
So it's not just about who you're sleeping with. It's about recognizing that couples, they often have these unspoken ideas about what monogamy means to them, and sometimes those ideas, they clash.
Yeah, that's so true. Like this source material talks about Kyle and Lucy, and they're mostly monogamous, but they have these occasional openings, and they actually find that these experiences, well, they make their relationship even closer, keep things exciting.
It's like, shaking things up a bit. And what I find really fascinating about their story is that they're not afraid to admit they enjoy this like triangular gaze thing. The idea that other people find their partner attractive, it actually turns them on.
Okay, I gotta admit, that's a new one for me.
Right.
It's like they've figured out how to turn like potential jealousy into something exciting.
Yeah.
But, I mean, let's be real, not everyone is wired like that.
No, for sure.
The source material also talks about, all the anxieties that can come up with non-monogamy.
Yeah.
Like this whole economics of addition thing.
Well, right. It's this fear that love and sex, they're like finite resources. If you're sharing them with other people, then there's less for you and your partner.
Right.
And that fear, man, it's powerful. It can lead to all sorts of problems, jealousy, insecurity, even resentment.
And we see that play out, right? Like in that story of Xavier and Phil, who basically ended up outsourcing their entire sex life, to other people.
Yeah.
And they completely neglected the intimacy they had with each other.
Oh, wow.
It's like a cautionary tale about how non-monogamy can go wrong if you don't approach it carefully.
It is. It's a good reminder that, non-monogamy can give you freedom and variety, but you also have to put in the work, right?
Yeah.
To make sure your main relationship is strong, that everyone's needs are being met.
So if C&M can be so tricky, how do couples actually navigate all this without, like, totally imploding?
Well, the source material emphasizes how important it is to set clear boundaries.
Okay.
Not like rigid rules, but more like, fluid boundaries that you can adjust as you go based on what you and your partner need.
Got it. And I guess that could look different for each person in the relationship, right?
Exactly. Like, you see that with Celine and Jerome. It's only Celine who has relationships outside their partnership.
Right.
And then there's Jax and Emmett, where it's Jax who seeks specific things outside the relationship, and Emmett's totally okay with it. So the important thing is those agreements, they're tailored to what that specific couple wants and needs.
That makes sense. But with all this talk about different needs and desires, how do you make sure there's still a balance of power? Like, couldn't an open relationship be harmful if one person feels pressured or like they have to go along with it?
You're absolutely right. It's super important to be aware of those power dynamics, especially when it comes to non-monogamy. Like, remember Tyler and Joannie?
Oh, yeah, the couple where Tyler was the one pushing for an open relationship. But it seemed pretty clear that Joannie wasn't all that comfortable with it.
Exactly. And that situation, it could have been really bad for Joannie, because she wasn't going into it because she really wanted to.
Right.
The source material really drives home the point that for non-monogamy to work, it has to be equal. There has to be trust.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can lead to all sorts of resentment, and heartache.
So it sounds like to do non-monogamy right, it takes a lot of work. Like being really self-aware and communicating well. Maybe even more than in those traditional, monogamous relationships.
That's a really interesting point, actually. And it makes me think about this bigger conversation we're having these days, about how we define love and commitment. Yeah. Like, it's the 21st century, right? We're seeing so many different ways that people are doing family, blended families, open adoptions, same-sex marriage. It's almost like we're rewriting the rules, as we go along.
Yeah, and CNM is part of that, isn't it? Like it's challenging what we think is normal and showing us that maybe there are other ways to have a loving, committed relationship.
Exactly. And the source material actually talks about polyamory as a model where people have multiple loving, committed relationships all at the same time.
Okay.
And it's not just about romance or sex. A lot of people who practice polyamory, they really emphasize how important it is to build strong emotional bonds, to create this sense of like a chosen family.
So it's like instead of limiting love, you're actually expanding the circle.
Right. And the source material mentions that this can be especially appealing to people who, maybe they crave a sense of community or they feel kind of stifled by that traditional nuclear family model.
Yeah, I could see that.
And that's a key point, I think. Polyamory often goes along with this idea of rejecting that, that whole idea that romantic love has to be the only foundation for building a family.
But I mean, I can only imagine that comes with its own set of challenges.
I don't know, for sure.
I mean, just managing one relationship can be tough enough. How do people juggle multiple partnerships? The logistics, the emotions, all of it.
Well, as you might guess, communication and having those clear agreements, super essential in polyamorous relationships.
Makes sense.
And the source material actually, it goes into this story of Deborah, William, and Abigail. They're a triad raising a child together.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're dealing with all these questions, right? Like legal rights, social acceptance, making sure everyone's needs are met, as individuals and as a family.
Sounds incredibly complicated, but also really brave. Like they're basically challenging the very definition of family and pushing the boundaries of what society thinks is okay.
Yeah, it's definitely a pioneering path. And they're not the only ones. The source material also introduces us to Diana Adams. She's a lawyer who's fighting for legal and social protections for non-traditional families.
Interesting.
She believes that everyone, no matter how their family is structured, they deserve equal rights and recognition under the law.
So what kind of legal challenges do non-traditional families actually face? Does the source material offer any solutions or like ideas for change?
Well, one big issue is that multiple partner relationships, they're not legally recognized in most places.
Right.
Marriage is still defined as between two people. So, that leaves polyamorous families in a really vulnerable spot when it comes to things like inheritance, child custody, even just being able to visit each other in the hospital.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, and Diana Adams, she argues that we need to move past that traditional two-parent model. We need to create laws that reflect how families actually are today.
It's like the fight for marriage equality. That was just the beginning. Now we're seeing this whole new wave of challenges to how we view relationships, what we think is normal.
Exactly. The whole push for same-sex marriage really opened up this conversation about, well, what is marriage anyway? Who gets to decide?
Right.
And now with CNM and polyamory becoming more, visible, we're seeing people questioning the traditional ways of doing relationships even more radically.
So it's not just about changing WHO we love. It's about changing how we think about love itself.
Exactly. CNM and polyamory, they challenge that whole idea that love is this limited thing you can only share with one person.
Yeah.
And they force us to confront, our own assumptions about commitment, jealousy, what it means to be in a loving relationship.
It's interesting. The source material really emphasizes communication and transparency as being so important for non-monogamous relationships to work.
Yeah.
And it actually seems like, in some ways, people who practice polyamory, they're more intentional about having those tough conversations than a lot of monogamous couples.
That's a great observation. It's almost like by stepping outside of that traditional monogamous framework, people are kind of forced to be more direct about communication, consent, their own boundaries.
So are you saying that even if someone's committed to monogamy, there are things they can learn from the way polyamorous people approach relationships?
Absolutely. I think, we can all learn from each other no matter what kind of relationship we choose. The key is to be open-minded, curious and willing to question our own assumptions.
I love that. So it's not about saying monogamy is wrong or that polyamory is the only way to go. It's about recognizing that there's this whole spectrum of ways to experience love and commitment.
Exactly. And it's about having the courage to create relationships that really work for us, even if they don't fit that, traditional mold.
This whole conversation has me thinking about how we often just take this idea of fidelity for granted. Like we just assume it means sexual exclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it's time to rethink what fidelity means to us.
I think that's a brilliant idea. If monogamy isn't just automatically assumed, then fidelity has to be about something more than just, who you're sleeping with.
Exactly. It's about honoring the promises you've made to your partner, whatever those promises are. Yeah. It's about, showing up for each other, even when it's tough. It's about choosing to be present, to be engaged in that relationship.
And it's about recognizing that, relationships can change and evolve over time without losing that core connection.
Right.
What matters is that both people feel loved, respected, supported.
I love that. It really seems like so much of this comes down to having honest conversations, with ourselves and our partners about what we really want, what we need.
Exactly. And those conversations, they can be uncomfortable, but they're so important if we want to have healthy, fulfilling relationships.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the history of monogamy to, all these alternative ways people are doing relationships these days.
We've talked about the challenges, the anxieties, and, this incredible potential for growth and connection that's out there in this whole evolving landscape of human relationships.
It's true. So, okay, where does all this leave us? We've talked about the history of monogamy and like all the ins and outs of CNM, even touched on polyamory a bit. Mm-hmm. What are people supposed to take away from all this? Like, what do we do with this information?
I don't think there's one right answer, or a set of rules everyone should follow. But I do think it's interesting that exploring all these different ways of doing relationships, even if they seem, completely different from your own experience, it can actually help you be more aware, more conscious in any relationship.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, just think about it. When was the last time you sat down with your partner, whether you're monogamous, dating, whatever, and actually defined what fidelity means to you? Not what society says, not what your parents did, but what it means for the two of you.
To be honest, probably never.
Yeah.
I think we just kind of assume we're on the same page about that stuff. But maybe that's not such a good idea.
The source material talks about that, especially in Tammy Nelson's work. She talks about how couples often have these two different monogamy contracts. One they talk about, out in the open, and one that's just kind of assumed based on their own values and stuff. And when those two contracts clash, well, that's when things get messy.
Right. It's like those unspoken expectations can really backfire. Like, didn't someone say assumptions are the termites of relationships or something like that?
Exactly. So the point is, whether or not you're interested in, trying non-monogamy, the real value here is using this information to start those deeper conversations with yourself and with your partner.
So it's not about judging other people's choices or saying one way is better than another. It's about using this knowledge to build relationships that are, more honest, more intentional, and ultimately just more fulfilling, no matter what they look like.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And the best part is it's an ongoing process. Relationships, they're not static. They change and evolve, and they require, communication, being willing to adapt, and just growing, both as individuals and as a couple.
Yeah, we're all on this journey of figuring out what love and commitment mean. And the more perspectives we see, the richer our understanding becomes.
Woo. And that's really what the deep dive is all about, right? Giving you the knowledge and the tools to make your own decisions, to challenge your own assumptions, and to, just create a life that reflects who you truly are.
That's a great way to put it. So we've definitely thrown a lot of food for thought at you today, but we want to leave you with a few key questions. What does fidelity mean to you? How do you define a successful relationship? What are your non-negotiables? And are you talking about those with your partner?
And don't forget, there are no right or wrong answers. This is about you exploring, having honest conversations, and being brave enough to create relationships that truly reflect what you value and what you want.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the ever-changing world of relationships. Thanks for being here. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep loving fiercely, whatever that